In this video, we're going to review and explore the facts behind Man on Fire, 2004. We'll talk about the story, cast performances, direction, cinematography, music, behind-the-scenes facts, box office, critical reception, and why this movie is still considered one of the greatest revenge thrillers ever made. So, without wasting any time, let's get started. One of the biggest reasons Man on Fire still stands out today is because it refuses to follow the typical action movie formula. On paper, the story sounds familiar. A former professional with a troubled past forms a bond with someone who changes his life, and a violent chain of events pushes him toward revenge. Hollywood has used that structure countless times. What makes this film different is the amount of emotional weight carried by every decision. The action isn't the main attraction. Instead, it's the emotional payoff to everything the movie patiently builds beforehand. That's why the film continues to resonate with audiences long after the credits roll. Brian Helgeland's screenplay deserves enormous credit for understanding that revenge only becomes satisfying when viewers genuinely care about the person seeking it. Rather than rushing into conflict, the script spends valuable time introducing John Creasy as someone who has completely lost faith in himself. He's physically alive, but emotionally exhausted. Years of violence, regret, and loneliness have left him disconnected from the world around him. The screenplay never explains every detail through long conversations. Instead, it trusts Denzel Washington's performance to communicate much of that pain through silence and subtle expressions. That restraint immediately separates Man on Fire from many action thrillers that rely heavily on exposition. Denzel Washington delivers one of the most emotionally layered performances of his career. What's remarkable is how much he communicates without saying very much. His posture, tired eyes, slow movements, and quiet delivery all suggest someone carrying years of emotional scars. He never tries to make Creasy look invincible or larger than life. In fact, the character often appears fragile, uncertain, and emotionally broken. That vulnerability becomes one of the film's greatest strengths because it makes every later decision feel deeply personal rather than simply heroic. Washington understands that true strength isn't always loud, and his restrained approach gives the character incredible authenticity. Dakota Fanning deserves equal praise because her performance provides the emotional balance the story needs. Child actors sometimes struggle to create believable chemistry with experienced performers, but that never becomes an issue here. Fanning brings genuine warmth, intelligence, and natural humor to her role without ever feeling overly cute or artificially charming. Her conversations with Denzel Washington feel completely believable because they develop gradually. Their relationship isn't built through dramatic speeches but through small everyday moments that slowly establish trust. Those quiet interactions become the emotional foundation of the entire movie, making everything that follows carry much greater impact. Tony Scott's direction also deserves close attention because this film represents one of the most distinctive visual styles of his career. He wasn't interested in making a conventional thriller. Instead, he experimented with rapid editing, shifting film textures, color grading, slow motion, fast motion, subtitles, and layered visual effects to create an emotional experience rather than simply recording events. These choices divided critics when the movie was first released, but many viewers appreciated how different it felt from standard Hollywood action films. Looking back today, those stylistic decisions have become one of the reasons Man on Fire remains instantly recognizable. Paul Cameron's cinematography plays a major role in creating that identity. Mexico City isn't treated like a generic location where action happens. Instead, it becomes an important part of the storytelling. The city feels alive, crowded, colorful, and unpredictable. Wide shots capture its enormous scale, while tighter compositions emphasize how isolated Creasy feels despite constantly being surrounded by people. That contrast between physical crowds and emotional loneliness quietly reinforces one of the film's central themes. Every visual choice appears designed to support the emotional journey rather than simply creating attractive images. Another impressive technical achievement is Pietro Scalia's editing. Tony Scott's directing style depends heavily on rhythm, and Scalia ensures those visual experiments never completely overwhelm the audience. Quiet emotional conversations receive enough space to breathe, while moments of tension feel fast without becoming confusing. The editing creates an almost musical flow between scenes, constantly shifting emotional intensity while maintaining narrative clarity. Even viewers who normally dislike highly stylized editing often acknowledge that it fits the emotional atmosphere of Man on Fire remarkably well. Harry Gregson Williams' musical score also deserves special recognition because it quietly carries much of the film's emotional weight. Instead of constantly announcing dramatic moments, the music often supports quieter emotional scenes where characters simply share ordinary conversations. Those softer compositions make the relationship between Creasy and Peta feel sincere rather than sentimental. Later, when the emotional intensity increases, the score naturally evolves alongside it without ever becoming overly manipulative. It's one of those soundtracks that many viewers remember emotionally even if they can't immediately recall specific musical themes. The sound design follows the same philosophy. Rather than filling every moment with loud effects, the filmmakers carefully balance silence, dialogue, music, and environmental sound. This creates an atmosphere where even ordinary conversations feel meaningful. When action finally arrives, its impact feels stronger because the film hasn't spent the entire runtime overwhelming the audience with constant noise. This disciplined approach reflects Tony Scott's understanding that emotional contrast is often more powerful than non-stop intensity. One fascinating behind-the-scenes fact involves the casting of Dakota Fanning. Although she was already gaining recognition as one of Hollywood's most talented young actresses, Man on Fire became one of the performances that truly established her dramatic reputation. Denzel Washington has spoken positively about working with her, often praising her professionalism and maturity despite her young age. Their natural chemistry wasn't something that could simply be written into the script. It developed because both actors approached their roles with complete sincerity, and that authenticity remains visible in every shared scene. The film itself is based on J. Quinnell's novel of the same name, although this wasn't the first adaptation. A version had already been produced in 1987. Tony Scott's interpretation, however, brought a much more emotionally driven perspective while updating several aspects of the story. Rather than focusing primarily on suspense, the 2004 adaptation places much greater emphasis on redemption and personal transformation. That emotional focus is one of the reasons many viewers consider it the definitive version of the story. Financially, the movie performed well with a worldwide box office of roughly $130 million against its estimated $70 million budget. While those numbers represented solid commercial success, the film's true legacy developed later through home video, cable television, and streaming services. Many younger viewers discovered Man on Fire years after its theatrical release, and its reputation continued growing with every new generation. It's one of those films that seems to become more appreciated as time passes rather than less. Perhaps the most remarkable achievement during the opening portion of the film is how effectively it earns the audience's emotional investment before relying on any major action. That's a difficult balance to achieve because many revenge thrillers rush toward violence as quickly as possible. Man on Fire understands that patience creates stronger emotional payoff. By taking time to establish believable relationships, damaged personalities, and genuine emotional stakes, the movie ensures that every later development carries far greater significance. That thoughtful foundation is one of the biggest reasons the film continues to stand among the finest revenge dramas of the modern era. One of the smartest creative decisions in Man on Fire is that it never tries to convince the audience that John Creasy is a traditional hero. Action movies often introduce their lead as someone who is physically unstoppable, mentally sharp, and always in control of every situation. Creasy is almost the complete opposite. Long before the story asks him to face external dangers, he's already fighting an internal battle that seems impossible to win. He's carrying years of guilt, emotional exhaustion, and self-doubt, and the film never rushes past those feelings just to reach the action. That choice gives the character far more depth than audiences usually expect from this genre. Brian Helgeland's screenplay deserves enormous praise because it understands that emotional healing is rarely simple. Instead of giving Creasy one inspiring conversation that suddenly changes his outlook on life, the script allows that transformation to happen naturally over time. Small moments of trust, ordinary conversations, shared humor, and quiet companionship gradually begin changing the way he sees himself. It's a subtle process, and that's exactly why it feels believable. Real emotional recovery rarely happens all at once. The screenplay respects that truth, making every positive step feel earned rather than manufactured. Denzel Washington deserves special recognition for how patiently he approaches this emotional journey. He never forces the audience to sympathize with Creasy through dramatic speeches or emotional breakdowns. Instead, his performance relies on incredibly small details. A hesitant smile, a longer pause before speaking, or the slight change in his posture often communicates more than pages of dialogue ever could. Washington trusts viewers to notice these changes without pointing them out directly. That confidence results in one of the most mature performances of his career, proving once again why he's considered one of the finest actors of his generation. Dakota Fanning continues matching that level of honesty with a performance that feels remarkably genuine. Her character could have easily become a simple emotional device designed only to motivate the lead, but Fanning gives her real personality. She's intelligent, curious, energetic, and surprisingly mature for her age without ever sounding unnatural. The relationship between Creasy and Peta succeeds because both actors treat it with complete sincerity. Neither performance feels exaggerated. Instead, their connection develops through ordinary conversations that gradually become meaningful. Those quiet moments ultimately become the emotional heart of the entire movie. Tony Scott's direction also deserves even more appreciation because of the confidence behind every creative decision. Rather than imitating the visual style of other action films from the early 2000s, he creates something completely his own. Fast shutter speeds, textured film grain, shifting color palettes, subtitles placed directly inside the frame, rapid editing, and unusual camera movement all combine to create an emotional rhythm rather than a purely realistic presentation. Some viewers initially found this style overwhelming, but with time it has become one of the defining qualities that makes Man on Fire instantly recognizable. Paul Cameron's cinematography plays an equally important role in supporting that vision. Mexico City is photographed with enormous respect for both its beauty and complexity. The movie doesn't reduce the city to a dangerous stereotype. Instead, it presents a place filled with energy, culture, wealth, poverty, hope, and fear existing side by side. The urban environment constantly reflects the emotional uncertainty surrounding the characters. Crowded streets, busy intersections, towering buildings, and quieter residential areas all contribute to a world that feels authentic rather than artificially constructed for dramatic effect. Another technical achievement that deserves attention is Pietro Scalia's editing. This isn't simply fast editing designed to create excitement. Every visual transition supports the emotional tone of each scene. Calm moments are allowed to breathe, while periods of heightened tension become increasingly fragmented and energetic. That shifting rhythm mirrors Creasy's emotional state throughout the film. Instead of treating editing as an invisible technical process, Tony Scott and Scalia use it as another storytelling tool, helping audiences experience the character's psychology rather than simply observing events from a distance. Harry Gregson Williams delivers one of his strongest film scores here. His music rarely tries to overpower the performances. Instead, it quietly supports the emotional atmosphere while allowing silence to remain equally important. Softer piano melodies, subtle orchestral themes, and restrained electronic textures combine beautifully, creating a soundtrack that feels emotional without becoming sentimental. The score understands exactly when to step forward and when to disappear, allowing the performances to remain the primary focus. The sound design follows the same philosophy of restraint. Instead of making every action sequence louder than the last, the filmmakers carefully balance dialogue, environmental sounds, music, and silence. That contrast makes emotional moments feel just as powerful as physical confrontations. Many viewers remember the movie primarily for its action, but much of its emotional impact actually comes from these quieter technical decisions happening beneath the surface. One fascinating production fact is that Tony Scott reportedly encouraged a collaborative atmosphere on set, giving actors room to explore emotional moments naturally rather than forcing every scene to match the script exactly. That flexibility helped Denzel Washington and Dakota Fanning build believable chemistry that feels spontaneous instead of rehearsed. Washington has often spoken about how impressed he was by Fanning's professionalism, noting that she approached scenes with the focus and discipline of a much more experienced performer. Their genuine respect for each other is clearly visible throughout the film. The production itself also benefited from filming extensively on location in Mexico City. Instead of recreating the environment through studio sets, the filmmakers embraced real locations whenever possible. This decision gives the movie an authenticity that's difficult to fake. Streets, neighborhoods, traffic, architecture, and everyday life all contribute to a world that feels lived in. Production designer Chris Seegers complemented these locations by creating environments that blended naturally with the city's existing character, avoiding the polished artificiality sometimes found in large studio productions. Financially, Man on Fire proved that character-driven action films could still attract audiences. While its worldwide gross of around $130 million didn't place it among the biggest blockbusters of 2004, it represented a strong performance for an R-rated thriller built around emotional storytelling instead of non-stop spectacle. More importantly, the movie's reputation continued growing through DVD sales, television broadcasts, and eventually streaming platforms, where entirely new audiences discovered it years later. Perhaps the most impressive aspect of the film at this stage is how effortlessly it combines emotional sincerity with technical ambition. Many movies that experiment visually forget about character, while others with strong emotional stories play things too safely from a filmmaking perspective. Man on Fire succeeds because it refuses to choose between those two strengths. Tony Scott delivers bold direction, Denzel Washington provides one of his most memorable performances, and every technical department works toward the same emotional goal. That combination is incredibly difficult to achieve, which is exactly why the film continues standing out more than 20 years after its original release. One of the reasons Man on Fire has aged so well is because it understands that memorable action isn't created by explosions or gunfire alone. Those things can certainly be exciting, but without emotional context they rarely leave a lasting impression. Tony Scott and Brian Helgeland clearly understood this from the beginning. Every major action sequence in the film feels connected to John Creasy's emotional journey rather than existing simply to entertain. That's why the violence carries emotional weight instead of feeling like empty spectacle. Viewers aren't just watching exciting scenes unfold, they're watching the decisions of a man whose entire view of life has been transformed. The screenplay also deserves recognition for how naturally it explores redemption without turning the story into a sentimental drama. Redemption is one of the oldest themes in cinema, yet it often becomes predictable because writers rely on familiar emotional shortcuts. Man on Fire avoids those cliches by refusing to suggest that redemption comes easily. Creasy isn't suddenly forgiven for his past, nor does he instantly become a different person. Instead, the screenplay presents redemption as something earned through difficult choices, personal sacrifice, and genuine emotional growth. That mature approach gives the film a level of depth that many action thrillers never attempt. Denzel Washington continues delivering an extraordinary performance because he understands that emotional restraint often creates greater impact than dramatic expression. Throughout the film, Creasy rarely speaks more than necessary. Instead of explaining his emotions, he carries them quietly. Washington uses silence almost as effectively as dialogue, allowing viewers to understand the character's internal struggle through posture, eye contact, and subtle changes in expression. Few actors can communicate so much with so little, and it's one of the reasons this performance remains among the most respected of his career. Dakota Fanning also continues proving why this role became one of the defining performances of her early career. She never feels like a child actor delivering memorized lines. Instead, she behaves naturally, responding to situations with believable curiosity, intelligence, and emotional honesty. Her chemistry with Denzel Washington develops so effortlessly that the audience quickly forgets they're watching two actors. They genuinely feel like two people whose lives unexpectedly become deeply connected. That authenticity becomes the emotional foundation of the entire film and is ultimately what makes the story so memorable. Tony Scott's directing style deserves even greater appreciation today than it received at the time of release. His visual choices were often criticized for being overly stylized, but many of those same techniques are now viewed as innovative rather than distracting. Rapid cuts, shifting color tones, multiple exposure effects, handwritten subtitles, and fragmented visual textures all serve a purpose beyond simply looking different. They reflect Crisci's emotional instability, his fragmented state of mind, and the chaotic world surrounding him. Once viewed from that perspective, Scott's visual language becomes much easier to appreciate. Paul Cameron's cinematography supports that vision beautifully. Every location feels authentic because the camera never treats Mexico City as a tourist destination or a generic crime setting. Instead, it captures the city's energy, contrasts, and complexity with remarkable honesty. Busy streets, elegant neighborhoods, crowded intersections, and quieter residential areas all become important parts of the atmosphere. Rather than separating the characters from their environment, the cinematography constantly reminds viewers that the city itself influences everything happening around them. The production design deserves praise for the same reason. Chris Seegers and his team avoided creating environments that looked overly polished or cinematic. Homes, offices, schools, restaurants, and streets all feel lived in. This attention to realism strengthens every performance because the actors interact with spaces that resemble real locations instead of carefully arranged movie sets. It's one of those technical achievements audiences often overlook because it feels completely natural, but that authenticity quietly supports the emotional credibility of the story. Pietro Scalia's editing remains one of the movie's most distinctive technical strengths. Rather than following conventional Hollywood pacing, the editing constantly adapts to the emotional tone of each moment. Quiet scenes unfold patiently, allowing viewers to absorb conversations and performances. More intense moments become visually fragmented, creating a feeling of urgency without sacrificing clarity. That emotional rhythm gives the film its unique identity and demonstrates how editing can become an essential storytelling tool rather than simply connecting scenes together. Harry Gregson Williams' score continues complementing that emotional rhythm perfectly. One of the soundtrack's greatest strengths is its ability to remain understated. Instead of constantly announcing dramatic moments with loud orchestral cues, the music often supports scenes almost invisibly. Softer melodies allow emotional conversations to breathe naturally, while more intense compositions arrive only when truly necessary. This disciplined approach prevents the score from overwhelming the performances, allowing the emotional connection between characters to remain the audience's primary focus. Sound design also deserves recognition because it reflects the same philosophy of balance. The movie doesn't rely on constant gunfire or explosive sound effects to maintain excitement. Instead, silence becomes just as important as noise. Environmental sounds such as traffic, footsteps, distant voices, and city ambience quietly reinforce the realism of every location. These subtle details help immerse viewers in the world without drawing unnecessary attention to themselves. Great sound design often succeeds because audiences barely notice it, and that's certainly true here. One particularly interesting production fact involves Tony Scott's close collaboration with Denzel Washington throughout filming. The two had previously worked together and shared a strong creative relationship built on mutual trust. Scott reportedly encouraged Washington to shape certain emotional moments according to his instincts rather than rigidly following every line exactly as written. That creative freedom helped produce a performance that feels remarkably natural and emotionally honest. Their collaboration would later continue on additional projects, further proving how successful their partnership had become. The film's action choreography also deserves appreciation because it prioritizes realism over spectacle. Physical confrontations rarely look glamorous or overly choreographed. Instead, they feel dangerous, exhausting, and emotionally charged. The stunt team focused on making every movement appear practical and believable rather than exaggerated. Combined with Tony Scott's energetic visual style, these grounded action sequences create tension without losing credibility. Even viewers who have seen countless action films often comment on how emotionally different the violence feels in Man on Fire. Audience reception has also evolved significantly over time. While critics were initially divided over the movie's experimental visual presentation, audiences embraced its emotional storytelling almost immediately. As years passed, many critics revisited the film with fresh appreciation, recognizing that Tony Scott's stylistic decisions were closely connected to the emotional themes rather than existing purely for visual effect. Today, Man on Fire is frequently cited as one of the strongest revenge thrillers of the 2000s and remains one of Denzel Washington's most beloved performances. Perhaps the greatest achievement of this film is that it never forgets its emotional purpose. Beneath every visual experiment, every action sequence, and every dramatic moment lies a story about healing, redemption, sacrifice, and finding meaning after believing life has nothing left to offer. That emotional honesty is what continues separating Man on Fire from countless other action films released during the same era. More than 20 years later, it's still remembered not just for what happens, but for how deeply it makes audiences care about the people experiencing it. One of the qualities that makes Man on Fire feel timeless is the confidence it has in its audience. The film never stops to explain every emotion or spell out every character's motivation through lengthy dialogue. Instead, it trusts viewers to read facial expressions, notice changes in behavior, and understand emotions that remain unspoken. That level of confidence is surprisingly rare in mainstream action cinema. Many films constantly remind the audience how they're supposed to feel, but Tony Scott allows emotions to develop naturally. Because of that, the story feels more personal and far more rewarding on repeat viewings. A large part of that success comes from Brian Helgeland's screenplay. Even though the movie is based on a J. Quinnell's novel, the adaptation feels remarkably cinematic. Helgeland understands that movies communicate through images and performances just as much as dialogue. Instead of filling every scene with explanations, he leaves room for silence and observation. The screenplay also avoids turning its central themes into obvious messages. Ideas such as forgiveness, purpose, sacrifice, and redemption grow organically through the characters rather than being delivered as speeches. That subtle approach makes the emotional impact much stronger because viewers arrive at those conclusions on their own. Denzel Washington deserves even more credit when discussing the screenplay because he knows exactly when to let silence do the work. Many actors would be tempted to make John Creasy more dramatic or openly emotional, but Washington consistently chooses restraint. His performance is built around control. Every small smile, brief pause, or quiet glance feels meaningful because he never overuses those moments. Watching him closely reveals an actor who understands that genuine emotion often appears in the smallest details rather than the biggest gestures. It's a masterclass in understated acting that continues to impress both casual viewers and film enthusiasts. Dakota Fanning's contribution becomes even more remarkable when considering her age during production. She carries herself with confidence that many adult performers struggle to achieve. More importantly, she never appears to be performing for the camera. Her reactions feel spontaneous, her conversations feel natural, and her emotional scenes avoid unnecessary exaggeration. The bond she builds with Denzel Washington works because neither actor tries to force chemistry. Instead, they create it through patience and authenticity. That relationship remains one of the strongest examples of believable on-screen chemistry between an adult actor and a child performer in modern cinema. Tony Scott's directing style deserves renewed appreciation because it reflects his willingness to take creative risks even after years of commercial success. Many established directors eventually become comfortable repeating familiar techniques, but Scott constantly searched for new ways to tell stories visually. In Man on Fire, he experiments with multiple camera formats, high-contrast lighting, rapid editing, layered imagery, handwritten subtitles, and shifting color palettes. None of these choices feel random. Every visual decision reflects the emotional instability surrounding the characters, making the audience experience tension rather than simply observe it. That's one reason the movie still feels visually unique more than 2 decades later. Paul Cameron's cinematography strengthens those ideas beautifully. The camera frequently moves with purpose instead of remaining static, creating a feeling that the world itself is constantly changing around the characters. Lighting also plays an important role. Bright daylight often carries emotional warmth, while darker scenes emphasize uncertainty and isolation. Cameron doesn't rely on beautiful compositions simply for aesthetic value. Every frame supports the emotional tone of the story. This careful collaboration between director and cinematographer gives the film an identity that immediately stands apart from many other thrillers released during the same period. The editing by Pietro Scalia remains one of the movie's most discussed technical achievements. During its original release, some critics argued that the editing style was too aggressive. Looking back today, however, it's easier to appreciate how closely that rhythm matches the emotional state of the characters. Moments of peace flow gently, while periods of anxiety become visually fragmented. Instead of distracting from the narrative, those editing choices place viewers inside Creasy's emotional perspective. The result is an experience that feels immersive rather than merely observational. Harry Gregson Williams also delivers a score that deserves far more recognition than it often receives. Rather than competing with the visuals, the music quietly supports them. Emotional themes appear gradually and evolve alongside the characters instead of constantly announcing dramatic moments. The score blends orchestral arrangements with subtle electronic textures, creating a sound that feels modern while remaining emotionally rich. It's one of those soundtracks that becomes more impressive with repeated viewings because of how carefully it's woven into the storytelling. Another technical strength is the film's production design. Chris Seegers and his team focused on authenticity instead of visual perfection. Every location feels believable because it looks like a place where people genuinely live and work. Homes contain personal details, schools feel active rather than staged, and public spaces maintain the natural energy of everyday life. This realism grounds the story emotionally, allowing viewers to connect with the characters without constantly being reminded they're watching a carefully constructed Hollywood production. One fascinating behind-the-scenes detail is that Tony Scott spent significant time refining the film's visual style during post-production. Color timing, editing rhythms, subtitles, and visual textures were all adjusted with incredible precision to achieve the emotional atmosphere he envisioned. These weren't last-minute stylistic additions. They were carefully planned elements designed to make the audience feel Creasy's psychological state. That dedication to visual storytelling demonstrates why Tony Scott remained one of Hollywood's most respected action directors throughout his career. The casting process also deserves attention. While Denzel Washington was always the obvious centerpiece, choosing the right actor for the younger role was equally important. Dakota Fanning had already impressed audiences with earlier performances, but Man on Fire confirmed that she possessed remarkable dramatic instincts. Her ability to share the screen with one of the industry's greatest actors without ever being overshadowed remains one of the film's quiet achievements. The casting department deserves enormous credit for recognizing how essential that chemistry would become. Commercially, the movie continued building momentum long after leaving theaters. Its theatrical earnings of around $130 million worldwide represented a respectable success, but the film's lasting popularity came through DVD sales, television broadcasts, and later streaming services. Many people who consider Man on Fire one of their favorite films didn't actually watch it during its original release. Instead, they discovered it years later through recommendations, proving how powerful word of mouth can become when a movie leaves a lasting emotional impression. Perhaps the greatest compliment that can be given to Man on Fire is that it rewards repeated viewings. The first experience naturally focuses on emotion and suspense, but every revisit reveals new details hidden within performances, cinematography, editing, and sound design. Small gestures become more meaningful, visual choices become easier to appreciate, and thematic ideas become richer with familiarity. Very few action films offer that kind of depth. That's why this movie has gradually earned classic status among fans of the genre. It isn't remembered simply because of memorable action. It's remembered because every technical and creative element works together to tell an emotionally honest story that continues connecting with audiences year after year. What really separates Man on Fire from many revenge thrillers is the patience with which it develops its emotional foundation. A lot of films in this genre are eager to reach the action because that's what audiences expect. Tony Scott and Brian Helgeland take a completely different approach. They understand that revenge only has emotional value when the audience fully understands what has been lost. Instead of treating emotions as a brief introduction before the action begins, the film makes them the center of the entire experience. Every dramatic moment carries weight because viewers have already formed a genuine connection with the characters. That emotional investment transforms the movie from a standard thriller into something much more memorable. The screenplay also deserves praise for resisting simple moral answers. John Creasy isn't presented as a flawless hero, nor are his actions treated as unquestionably right. The story constantly reminds viewers that violence leaves consequences, regardless of who commits it. This moral complexity gives the film far greater maturity than many action movies from the same period. Rather than celebrating violence for its own sake, the screenplay explores what drives someone toward those choices and the emotional cost that follows. That balance allows audiences to understand Creasy without necessarily agreeing with every decision he makes. Denzel Washington continues to impress because he never allows the character to become larger than life. Even during moments that could easily become exaggerated, his performance remains grounded in emotion. He portrays Creasy as someone driven more by personal conviction than anger. The character rarely loses control emotionally, and that restraint actually makes him more intimidating. Washington understands that confidence doesn't always require loud dialogue or dramatic gestures. His calm, measured approach gives the performance remarkable authority while keeping it emotionally believable. One of the reasons Washington's performance works so well is because he constantly reacts instead of simply delivering lines. Great acting often comes from listening rather than speaking, and that's evident throughout the film. His facial expressions subtly change depending on who he's interacting with, revealing emotions that remain unspoken. Whether he's quiet, thoughtful, uncomfortable, or determined, every reaction feels truthful. It's this attention to emotional detail that keeps the audience invested even during scenes with very little dialogue. Dakota Fanning deserves continued recognition because she provides exactly the emotional balance the story requires. Her performance avoids every common stereotype associated with child characters in action films. She isn't unrealistically mature, nor is she written as helpless. Instead, she feels like a genuine child with intelligence, curiosity, fears, and optimism. Those qualities make her relationship with Creasy feel authentic rather than manufactured. The trust that gradually develops between them is built through ordinary human interaction instead of dramatic storytelling shortcuts, making the emotional payoff significantly more powerful. Tony Scott's visual direction also continues revealing new strengths with repeated viewings. At first glance, his style appears energetic and chaotic, but beneath that surface lies remarkable control. Every editing decision, camera movement, and visual effect serves the emotional rhythm of the story. The changing color palettes often reflect shifts in mood, while the camera becomes calmer during intimate moments and more aggressive when emotional pressure increases. Scott wasn't experimenting simply to stand out. His visual choices constantly reinforce what the characters are experiencing internally. Paul Cameron's cinematography deserves equal appreciation for capturing both intimacy and scale with impressive consistency. Close-up shots frequently allow audiences to study the actors' performances in remarkable detail, while wider shots remind viewers of the larger world surrounding them. Mexico City itself becomes almost another character within the film. Rather than existing only as a location, the city contributes to the overall atmosphere through its architecture, crowded streets, neighborhoods, and everyday activity. That sense of place gives the story additional realism that many studio productions struggle to achieve. The production design quietly strengthens this realism as well. Chris Seegers and his team avoided creating environments that felt overly polished or cinematic. Homes, schools, offices, and public spaces all appear lived in, containing the small imperfections that make real places believable. These subtle details may not immediately attract attention, but they help create an immersive world where audiences quickly forget they're watching a carefully constructed production. Great production design often succeeds by remaining invisible, and that's certainly true here. Harry Gregson Williams' musical score continues to demonstrate remarkable emotional intelligence. Instead of dominating scenes with constant orchestral power, the music often remains understated, allowing performances to remain the emotional focus. Gentle themes quietly accompany moments of reflection, while more dramatic compositions appear only when necessary. This careful balance prevents emotional scenes from feeling manipulated. Rather than telling viewers how to feel, the score simply supports emotions that are already present within the performances. The sound design follows a similar philosophy. Environmental sounds play an important role throughout the film, helping every location feel authentic. Conversations are allowed to remain clear without unnecessary background noise overwhelming them, while action sequences maintain impact without becoming exhausting. This careful attention to audio balance reflects the overall discipline visible throughout the production. Every technical department seems committed to serving the story rather than drawing attention to itself. One interesting behind-the-scenes fact is that Tony Scott was known for shooting an enormous amount of footage from multiple camera angles. This gave editor Pietro Scalia tremendous flexibility during post-production, allowing scenes to be shaped with incredible precision. While this approach required far more work in the editing room, it also helped create the distinctive visual rhythm that became one of the film's defining characteristics. Scott believed editing was where much of the movie's emotional energy would ultimately be created, and the finished film clearly reflects that philosophy. The movie's production also benefited from strong collaboration between departments. Costume design, makeup, cinematography, editing, and music all support the same emotional tone rather than competing for attention. John Creasy's appearance evolves naturally alongside his emotional journey, while the visual atmosphere consistently reflects the psychological state of the story. These details might seem small individually, but together they create a remarkably cohesive cinematic experience. Audience appreciation for Man on Fire has only grown stronger with time. Many films enjoy successful theatrical releases before slowly fading from public memory, but this movie followed the opposite path. Although critics were initially divided over Tony Scott's bold stylistic approach, audiences embraced the emotional storytelling from the beginning. As years passed, more reviewers revisited the film and acknowledged that many of its visual decisions were far more purposeful than they had first appeared. Today, it's widely regarded as one of the finest collaborations between Tony Scott and Denzel Washington. Ultimately, the greatest strength of Man on Fire lies in its emotional honesty. It never pretends that redemption is easy or that emotional pain can disappear overnight. Instead, it presents deeply flawed people searching for purpose in a complicated world. Every technical achievement, from the cinematography and editing to the music and performances, exists to support that central idea. That's why the movie continues to connect with viewers decades after its release. Long after the action is over, it's the emotional journey that stays with the audience, proving that the strongest revenge stories are rarely just about revenge. Another reason Man on Fire continues to receive so much appreciation is because it never treats its audience as if they only care about action. Many Hollywood thrillers assume viewers need a major set piece every few minutes to stay interested, but this film proves the opposite. Some of its strongest moments involve nothing more than two characters sharing a conversation or sitting together in silence. Those quieter scenes build trust, reveal personality, and create emotional depth. By the time the story reaches its most intense moments, the audience already understands exactly who these people are and why their choices matter. That careful pacing is one of the film's greatest strengths. Brian Helgeland's writing also deserves recognition for how naturally it balances realism with cinematic storytelling. The screenplay doesn't rely on long speeches explaining every emotion or every theme. Instead, it trusts viewers to interpret what they're seeing. Characters behave like real people rather than serving as vehicles for exposition. Conversations feel casual, imperfect, and believable, which makes the emotional relationships much stronger. Even when the story becomes more dramatic, it never completely loses that sense of authenticity. That's a difficult balance to achieve, and it's one of the reasons the screenplay still feels fresh today. Denzel Washington once again proves why he remains one of the most respected actors in modern cinema. His performance isn't built around dramatic outbursts or flashy emotional moments. Instead, it's defined by consistency. From beginning to end, Creasy feels like the same person, gradually changing through experience rather than suddenly becoming someone different. Washington allows those emotional changes to happen slowly, making them feel believable. His control over tone is remarkable. Whether the scene requires quiet vulnerability or determined confidence, he never overplays the emotion. That restraint gives the performance tremendous credibility. One particularly impressive aspect of Washington's acting is how well he communicates emotional conflict. Creasy is a man constantly wrestling with his own past, and those internal struggles remain visible throughout the film. Even during scenes with very little dialogue, viewers can sense the weight he's carrying. Washington achieves this through subtle physical performance rather than obvious emotional displays. His posture, eye contact, breathing, and timing all contribute to a character who feels deeply human. It's the kind of acting that often becomes even more impressive with repeated viewings because so much is happening beneath the surface. Dakota Fanning continues matching that emotional honesty with extraordinary maturity. Her performance never feels rehearsed or overly polished. She behaves naturally, reacting to situations with curiosity, kindness, and intelligence that feel completely believable for her character. Many child performances depend on exaggerated expressions or overly emotional dialogue, but Fanning avoids those traps entirely. She creates a character audiences genuinely care about because she simply feels real. Her chemistry with Denzel Washington remains one of the movie's defining strengths and provides the emotional foundation that supports everything else. Tony Scott's direction also deserves continued praise because of the confidence behind his artistic choices. Instead of following popular filmmaking trends of the early 2000s, he created a visual language that reflected emotion rather than realism. Color filters shift according to mood, editing rhythms change with emotional intensity, and camera movement constantly reinforces the psychological state of the characters. These stylistic choices were initially controversial, but they have aged remarkably well because they always serve the story. Rather than distracting from the narrative, they deepen the emotional experience. Paul Cameron's cinematography remains equally impressive throughout the film. His camera frequently captures intimate emotional moments without feeling intrusive. Close-up shots allow audiences to study subtle performances, while wider compositions establish the larger environment surrounding the characters. Mexico City itself continues feeling like an active participant in the story rather than simply a backdrop. The city's energy, architecture, traffic, and neighborhoods all contribute to an atmosphere that feels authentic and lived in. This sense of place strengthens the film's emotional realism considerably. The production design deserves additional appreciation for creating environments that support the story without drawing unnecessary attention to themselves. Every location feels practical and believable. Offices appear functional, homes feel personal, schools contain realistic details, and public spaces maintain the natural imperfections of everyday life. These design choices quietly reinforce the authenticity of the world, allowing audiences to focus entirely on the characters instead of noticing artificial movie sets. It's a subtle achievement, but one that significantly improves the viewing experience. Harry Gregson Williams continues delivering a score that perfectly understands emotional restraint. Rather than filling every scene with dramatic music, he often allows silence to remain just as important. Softer themes appear during reflective moments, gently supporting the performances without overwhelming them. When stronger musical cues finally arrive, they feel earned because the soundtrack hasn't been constantly demanding attention. This disciplined approach gives the score lasting emotional impact and makes it one of the film's most underrated strengths. The editing by Pietro Scalia deserves another mention because it represents much more than technical precision. Every transition between scenes contributes to the movie's emotional rhythm. Moments of peace unfold naturally, while periods of tension become increasingly fragmented. This constantly shifting pace mirrors Creasy's emotional journey remarkably well. Rather than editing solely for excitement, Scalia edits for feeling. That distinction may sound subtle, but it's one of the reasons Man on Fire feels so emotionally engaging compared to many other thrillers. One fascinating behind-the-scenes detail involves Tony Scott's relationship with visual experimentation. Throughout his career, he constantly searched for new ways to tell stories through editing and cinematography. Man on Fire became one of his boldest creative achievements because it allowed him to fully embrace those instincts. Working closely with editor Pietro Scalia and cinematographer Paul Cameron, Scott refined a visual style that blended emotional storytelling with modern filmmaking techniques. The result remains one of the most recognizable visual identities of any action film from the 2000s. The film also benefited from an outstanding supporting cast. While Denzel Washington naturally commands most of the attention, actors like Christopher Walken, Radha Mitchell, Marc Anthony, Giancarlo Giannini, and Mickey Rourke all contribute memorable performances. None of these characters feel like simple background figures. Each actor brings enough personality to make even relatively brief appearances feel meaningful. This strong ensemble helps create a believable world where every interaction contributes to the overall emotional atmosphere. The critical response to Man on Fire has changed dramatically over time. During its original release, many reviewers admired the performances but questioned Tony Scott's aggressive visual style. As filmmaking trends evolved, however, those same stylistic choices began receiving greater appreciation. Many critics who revisited the movie acknowledged that Scott's direction was far more emotionally motivated than they had initially believed. Today, the film is frequently praised not only for its performances but also for its willingness to take creative risks that distinguish it from more conventional action thrillers. Ultimately, what continues making Man on Fire special is its commitment to emotional truth. Every department, from writing and acting to cinematography, editing, music, and production design, works toward the same goal of telling a deeply human story. The action may attract viewers initially, but it's the emotional journey that keeps the film alive in people's memories. More than 20 years after its release, it remains a powerful reminder that the most unforgettable thrillers aren't defined by how many explosions they contain, but by how deeply they make audiences care about the people at the center of the story. By the time most people finish Man on Fire, one thing becomes very clear: the film isn't remembered because it reinvented the revenge genre. Instead, it's remembered because it perfected many of the elements that already existed within that genre. Countless movies have explored similar ideas, but very few combine emotional storytelling, memorable performances, stylish direction, and technical excellence with the same level of confidence. That's why the movie still appears in conversations about the greatest revenge thrillers ever made. It doesn't depend on surprising twists or complicated storytelling. Its strength comes from how honestly it tells a familiar story. One of the screenplay's biggest achievements is how carefully it controls emotional pacing. Many action films struggle with balance. They either spend too much time on character development and lose momentum, or they rush toward action and leave audiences emotionally disconnected. Brian Helgeland finds a middle ground that feels remarkably natural. Every emotional moment prepares viewers for what follows, and every action sequence carries greater meaning because of the relationships already established. Nothing feels disconnected. Every creative decision supports the same emotional direction from beginning to end. Denzel Washington continues proving why this role has remained one of the defining performances of his career. His portrayal of John Creasy feels deeply personal because it never relies on obvious emotional tricks. He avoids dramatic speeches, exaggerated expressions, and unnecessary displays of anger. Instead, he presents a man who has spent years hiding emotional pain beneath quiet discipline. That approach creates a character who feels believable from the very first scene until the final frame. Washington reminds audiences that true emotional power often comes from restraint rather than intensity. It's also worth appreciating how consistently Washington maintains the character throughout the film. Many performances begin strongly but gradually shift into something less believable as the story becomes more dramatic. That never happens here. Creasy remains emotionally recognizable regardless of the situation. His growth feels gradual instead of sudden, allowing viewers to believe every stage of his journey. Maintaining that level of consistency across an emotionally demanding role requires extraordinary discipline, and Washington delivers it with remarkable confidence. Dakota Fanning's performance becomes even more impressive when viewed alongside Washington's. She never tries to compete for attention or imitate his acting style. Instead, she brings her own natural energy to every scene. Her optimism, curiosity, and emotional honesty provide the perfect contrast to Creasy's quiet sadness. Together they create one of the most memorable on-screen relationships of the 2000s. Their connection never feels forced because it's built on mutual trust rather than dramatic dialogue. That emotional authenticity remains the foundation upon which the entire film succeeds. Tony Scott's direction deserves enormous praise for maintaining emotional focus despite his visually ambitious style. Directors who experiment with editing, color grading, and camera movement sometimes risk distracting audiences from the story. Scott avoids that problem because every stylistic decision serves the characters. His visual language reflects emotional states rather than existing simply for artistic effect. The changing textures, fragmented editing, shifting colors, and energetic camera work all help audiences experience the story emotionally instead of merely observing it. This careful balance between style and substance has become one of the film's defining strengths. Paul Cameron's cinematography continues supporting that vision with remarkable precision. Every frame feels thoughtfully composed without appearing artificial. Close-up shots allow subtle performances to shine, while wider images establish the scale and atmosphere of Mexico City. The city itself remains one of the movie's most important visual elements. Rather than reducing it to a simple setting, Cameron captures its complexity with honesty and respect. Wealth and poverty, beauty and danger, calm and chaos all exist side by side, creating a believable environment that strengthens the emotional realism of the story. The production design deserves similar recognition because it constantly reinforces authenticity. Every location feels occupied by real people rather than prepared for a film crew. Small details inside homes, offices, schools, and public spaces create an atmosphere that audiences instinctively accept as genuine. These subtle design choices may never become the focus of discussion, but they quietly support every performance by creating believable surroundings. Strong production design rarely calls attention to itself, and that's exactly what makes it so effective here. Harry Gregson Williams once again demonstrates exceptional musical discipline. His score never competes with the actors or attempts to manufacture emotion artificially. Instead, it quietly enhances scenes already carrying emotional weight. Delicate piano passages, restrained orchestral arrangements, and carefully placed electronic textures create an atmosphere that feels both intimate and cinematic. The soundtrack remains memorable precisely because it understands when silence can be more powerful than music. That level of restraint is surprisingly rare in modern action cinema. The sound design follows the same philosophy. Every environment feels alive because of carefully layered background sounds that never overwhelm dialogue. Streets have their own rhythm, buildings carry natural ambience, and quieter locations feel appropriately isolated. During action scenes, sound effects remain impactful without becoming excessively loud or unrealistic. This careful balance contributes enormously to the film's immersive quality, even if audiences don't consciously notice the technical craftsmanship behind it. One particularly interesting production fact is that Tony Scott and editor Pietro Scalia reportedly spent an enormous amount of time refining the film's pacing after principal photography had finished. Scott believed emotional rhythm was just as important as narrative structure, so scenes were carefully adjusted until every transition supported the psychological journey of the characters. That attention to detail helps explain why the movie flows so naturally despite its bold visual experimentation. Nothing feels random because every creative decision was shaped with emotional purpose. The collaboration between departments also deserves recognition. Costume design subtly reflects changes in character without becoming overly symbolic. Makeup remains realistic throughout, avoiding unnecessary glamour. Lighting shifts naturally according to mood rather than following obvious visual formulas. Together these departments create a cohesive cinematic experience where every element supports the same emotional vision. It's the kind of unified filmmaking that audiences may not immediately recognize but instinctively respond to while watching. The film's legacy has only continued growing with time. Although its theatrical performance was solid, Man on Fire truly became a classic through home entertainment and streaming platforms. Word-of-mouth recommendations introduced the movie to countless viewers who missed it during its original release. Many people now consider it one of Denzel Washington's finest performances and one of Tony Scott's greatest directorial achievements. It regularly appears on lists celebrating the best revenge films ever made, proving that genuine emotional storytelling often outlasts temporary box office success. Looking back today, it's easy to understand why Man on Fire has remained so influential. It demonstrates that action movies don't have to choose between excitement and emotional depth. They can deliver both when every creative department works toward the same goal. Strong writing, unforgettable performances, confident direction, beautiful cinematography, intelligent editing, thoughtful music, and authentic production design all combine to create something far more meaningful than a typical revenge thriller. That's why audiences continue discovering this film year after year, and why it still feels just as powerful now as it did when it first reached theaters. One aspect of Man on Fire that often goes unnoticed is how carefully it avoids becoming predictable, even though it follows a familiar genre structure. Most revenge thrillers depend on constant surprises or shocking twists to keep viewers engaged. This film chooses a different path. Instead of asking, what will happen next, it quietly encourages a more emotional question: how will these experiences change the people involved? That subtle shift completely changes the viewing experience. The story becomes less about plot mechanics and more about emotional consequences, allowing audiences to connect with the characters on a much deeper level. Brian Helgeland's screenplay deserves additional praise because it consistently values character over convenience. Whenever the story reaches an important emotional decision, the writing always asks what feels truthful for the characters instead of what might create the biggest spectacle. That discipline keeps the movie grounded even when the circumstances become increasingly intense. Many action films sacrifice believable character behavior in order to create dramatic moments, but Man on Fire rarely falls into that trap. Every important decision feels like something these characters would genuinely make based on everything the audience has already learned about them. Denzel Washington's performance continues revealing new layers every time the film is revisited. His portrayal of John Creasy isn't simply about emotional pain or quiet determination. There's also an underlying sense of exhaustion that never completely disappears. Even during moments when the character appears stronger or more confident, Washington subtly reminds viewers that Creasy remains someone carrying years of emotional damage. This consistency makes the performance incredibly believable because real emotional scars rarely disappear completely. They simply become easier to manage, and Washington communicates that idea with remarkable subtlety. Another impressive quality of his acting is his ability to create tension through stillness. Many action stars rely on physical movement or loud dialogue to dominate scenes, but Washington often achieves the opposite effect. He becomes most compelling when he remains calm. His quiet confidence naturally draws attention because audiences instinctively sense the emotional intensity beneath the surface. That restrained style gives the character a unique presence that feels very different from traditional Hollywood action heroes. Dakota Fanning continues matching Washington scene for scene without ever feeling overshadowed. Considering her age during production, her emotional intelligence remains astonishing. She understands exactly how much emotion each moment requires and never pushes beyond that point. Her performance feels effortless because she avoids obvious acting techniques. Instead, she behaves naturally, allowing audiences to believe in the character rather than admire the performance itself. That's one of the highest compliments any actor can receive, regardless of age. Tony Scott's direction also deserves recognition for its remarkable emotional discipline. Although his visual style is energetic and highly recognizable, he never allows technique to overshadow storytelling. Every creative decision serves the emotional journey rather than existing purely for visual impact. His use of fragmented editing, layered imagery, changing color tones, and dynamic camera movement all reinforce the psychological state of the characters. Those stylistic choices may initially appear bold, but beneath them lies a carefully controlled emotional structure that keeps the audience connected from beginning to end. Paul Cameron's cinematography strengthens this emotional structure through thoughtful composition and lighting. Close-up shots invite viewers to study subtle performances, while wider frames remind them of the larger environment surrounding the characters. Mexico City's visual identity remains one of the film's strongest assets. The city never feels like a generic backdrop created solely for action scenes. Instead, Cameron presents it as a living, breathing environment filled with energy, beauty, tension, and unpredictability. This authentic portrayal adds tremendous depth to the overall atmosphere. Production designer Chris Seegers also deserves continued praise for creating realistic environments that quietly support the story. Every location reflects the personalities and lifestyles of the people occupying it. Nothing appears overly polished or artificially dramatic. Schools feel active, homes contain believable details, offices appear functional, and public spaces maintain the natural imperfections of everyday life. These elements may not immediately attract attention, but they help create a world that audiences instinctively accept as genuine. Harry Gregson Williams' musical score remains one of the movie's most underrated achievements. Rather than treating every emotional moment with overwhelming orchestral music, he often chooses simplicity. Gentle piano melodies, restrained strings, and subtle electronic textures quietly support the performances without competing against them. This careful balance allows emotions to develop naturally instead of feeling manipulated. It's a soundtrack built on patience rather than volume, which perfectly matches the overall tone of the film. The sound design follows exactly the same philosophy. Every location carries its own unique atmosphere through carefully layered environmental sounds. Conversations remain clear without unnatural studio polish, while quieter scenes benefit from subtle background ambience that enhances realism. During action sequences, sound effects maintain power without becoming overwhelming. This thoughtful audio design demonstrates how every technical department worked toward the same emotional objective instead of simply trying to impress audiences with spectacle. One particularly interesting behind-the-scenes fact involves Tony Scott's editing philosophy. He believed that emotion should always determine pacing rather than strict narrative rules. As a result, editor Pietro Scalia reportedly experimented with numerous versions of individual scenes before settling on rhythms that best reflected the character's emotional states. This approach required enormous patience during post-production but ultimately gave the film its distinctive flow. It's one of the reasons Man on Fire feels emotionally immersive despite its unconventional editing style. Another fascinating production detail concerns the collaboration between Denzel Washington and Tony Scott. Having already developed mutual trust through previous work, they shared an understanding that allowed Washington considerable freedom in shaping his character's emotional responses. Scott valued instinctive performances and encouraged actors to focus on authenticity rather than technical perfection. That collaborative environment helped produce performances that still feel remarkably natural more than 20 years later. Audience appreciation has continued growing because the movie rewards emotional maturity. Younger viewers may initially remember the action, but many people who revisit the film later in life discover entirely different qualities. Themes of regret, personal responsibility, forgiveness, sacrifice, and finding purpose become increasingly meaningful with age. That's one reason Man on Fire has maintained such a loyal following across multiple generations. It offers something different depending on where viewers are in their own lives. Ultimately, the lasting success of Man on Fire comes from its refusal to simplify complex emotions. It never pretends that healing is easy, that justice is uncomplicated, or that personal redemption happens overnight. Instead, it presents flawed people trying to find meaning in extremely difficult circumstances. Every creative department supports that central idea with remarkable consistency, from the screenplay and performances to the cinematography, editing, music, and production design. More than 2 decades after its release, the film continues proving that emotional honesty will always outlast temporary trends, making it one of the most respected and enduring revenge thrillers of modern cinema. One of the film's greatest achievements becomes impossible to ignore. It never loses sight of its emotional identity. Many action thrillers begin with strong character work but gradually abandon those foundations once the larger set pieces arrive. Tony Scott avoids that mistake completely. Even during the film's most intense moments, every decision remains connected to emotion rather than spectacle. The action is never there simply because audiences expect it. It exists because the story has reached a point where those moments feel emotionally unavoidable. That discipline is one of the biggest reasons the movie continues standing above countless other revenge thrillers. Brian Helgeland's screenplay also deserves admiration for understanding the value of restraint. Rather than overloading the audience with unnecessary twists or constantly changing the direction of the story, the script stays focused on its central emotional journey. This confidence allows viewers to become fully invested in the characters without feeling distracted by overly complicated plotting. Simplicity, when executed well, often becomes far more powerful than complexity, and Man on Fire is an excellent example of that principle. The narrative remains emotionally rich because it never forgets what truly matters. Denzel Washington's performance reaches another level of appreciation when viewed in the context of his overall career. He's played charismatic leaders, determined investigators, conflicted heroes, and unforgettable villains, yet John Creasy remains one of his most emotionally layered characters. What makes the performance exceptional is its honesty. Washington never attempts to make Creasy more likable than he actually is. He accepts the character's flaws, regrets, and emotional wounds without trying to soften them for the audience. That honesty creates trust between the actor and the viewer, making every emotional moment feel authentic rather than manufactured. One particularly impressive quality of Washington's acting is his ability to balance physical presence with emotional vulnerability. Creasy clearly possesses strength and experience, but Washington never allows those qualities to overshadow the character's emotional fragility. Instead, both sides exist simultaneously. The audience sees someone capable of extraordinary determination while also recognizing the loneliness and guilt that continue shaping his decisions. Very few actors manage that balance as naturally as Washington does here, which is why the performance continues receiving praise decades after the film's release. Dakota Fanning remains equally deserving of recognition. Her performance succeeds because it feels completely sincere. She never appears to be acting for emotional effect or trying to impress the audience. Every reaction feels spontaneous, every conversation feels believable, and every emotional moment grows naturally from the relationships surrounding her character. It's easy to understand why so many viewers continue mentioning her performance whenever discussing Man on Fire. She provides the emotional warmth that gives the entire story its heart. Tony Scott's direction also becomes more impressive with each passing year because of how fearless it feels. He wasn't interested in making a visually ordinary thriller. Instead, he embraced techniques that reflected emotion rather than realism. Rapid editing, shifting colors, layered imagery, unusual subtitles, and constantly changing visual rhythms all contribute to an atmosphere unlike almost any other action film of its era. Some critics initially viewed these choices as excessive, but time has been remarkably kind to Scott's creative instincts. Today, those same stylistic decisions are often celebrated as one of the movie's defining strengths. Paul Cameron's cinematography deserves continued praise for maintaining visual consistency despite the film's constantly evolving emotional tone. Whether capturing intimate conversations or larger moments of tension, his photography always serves the characters first. Mexico City remains beautifully realized throughout, appearing vibrant, unpredictable, and authentic without ever feeling romanticized or simplified. Cameron understands that location can influence mood just as much as lighting or composition, and he uses every aspect of the environment to reinforce the emotional atmosphere. Pietro Scalia's editing continues demonstrating why he remains one of the industry's most respected editors. Every cut feels motivated by emotion rather than simply maintaining pace. Quiet scenes linger just long enough to allow performances to resonate, while more intense moments become increasingly fragmented without sacrificing clarity. This emotional rhythm gives the film a unique identity that immediately distinguishes it from more conventionally edited thrillers. Rather than following standard Hollywood formulas, Scalia creates a pace that feels completely connected to Creasy's psychological journey. Harry Gregson Williams once again proves how valuable musical restraint can be. Instead of announcing every emotional beat with dramatic orchestration, he often allows simple melodies to carry enormous emotional weight. The score supports rather than dominates the performances, creating an atmosphere that feels intimate even during larger cinematic moments. Many action soundtracks focus primarily on excitement, but Gregson Williams consistently prioritizes emotion. That decision gives the music lasting impact and perfectly complements Tony Scott's storytelling style. The production design quietly deserves another mention because it consistently reinforces realism. Every environment appears practical, functional, and occupied by real people. Nothing feels artificially designed simply to look impressive on screen. This attention to authenticity strengthens audience immersion because the world feels completely believable. When viewers accept the environment as real, they naturally become more emotionally invested in the people living within it. It's a subtle but incredibly important achievement. One fascinating behind-the-scenes fact involves the close creative relationship between Tony Scott and Denzel Washington. By the time they made Man on Fire, the two had developed enormous mutual respect, allowing for open creative collaboration throughout production. Scott trusted Washington's instincts completely, often encouraging him to shape emotional moments according to what felt most truthful for the character. This freedom contributed significantly to the natural, understated quality of Creasy's performance and became one of the defining strengths of the finished film. Another important aspect of the production was the commitment to filming on real locations whenever possible. Rather than relying heavily on studio environments, the filmmakers embraced Mexico City's actual streets, neighborhoods, and architecture. This decision not only enhanced visual authenticity but also helped actors respond naturally to their surroundings. Real environments often create performances that feel more grounded because actors interact with spaces that already possess genuine character and history. The legacy of Man on Fire continues growing because it appeals to multiple generations for different reasons. Some viewers admire it as an outstanding action film. Others appreciate its emotional storytelling, while many film enthusiasts study it for Tony Scott's distinctive visual direction. Very few movies succeed across so many different levels. It's equally satisfying for audiences seeking entertainment and for viewers interested in filmmaking craft. That broad appeal explains why recommendations for Man on Fire remain so common even decades after its original release. Looking back now, it's clear that the film succeeded because it understood something many action movies forget: audiences remember emotions far longer than explosions. Spectacular action may attract attention initially, but genuine emotional connection is what creates lasting memories. Through outstanding performances, thoughtful writing, confident direction, memorable cinematography, intelligent editing, and beautifully restrained music, Man on Fire delivers an experience that remains powerful long after the final scene. It's not simply one of the best revenge thrillers of its generation, it has earned a permanent place among the finest character-driven action films ever made. Another reason Man on Fire continues to feel fresh after so many years is that it never tries to imitate the blockbuster trends that were popular when it was released. In the early 2000s, many action films relied heavily on exaggerated heroes, non-stop explosions, and fast-paced storytelling designed to keep audiences constantly excited. Tony Scott certainly delivers memorable action here, but he approaches the genre from a much more emotional perspective. Instead of asking viewers to admire the hero's abilities, he encourages them to understand the hero's pain. That difference changes the entire experience and explains why the film still connects with modern audiences who may not even have been born when it first reached theaters. Brian Helgeland's screenplay also deserves recognition for how carefully it controls its emotional tone. The writing never becomes overly sentimental, yet it never feels cold or detached either. Finding that balance is much harder than it appears. If the script leaned too heavily toward emotion, it could have lost its dramatic tension. If it focused only on suspense, the audience would never become emotionally invested in the characters. Helgeland successfully keeps both elements working together, allowing every conversation and every important decision to feel honest without slowing the film's overall momentum. Denzel Washington once again reminds audiences why he has remained one of Hollywood's most respected actors for decades. His performance works because he completely disappears into the role of John Creasy. At no point does it feel like a movie star trying to impress viewers. Instead, Washington presents a deeply flawed man searching for purpose after years of emotional suffering. He avoids obvious acting choices and trusts subtle details to carry the performance. A brief glance, a quiet pause, or a change in his voice often communicates more than pages of dialogue could ever achieve. One of the most remarkable qualities of Washington's performance is its emotional consistency. From beginning to end, every decision feels motivated by the same internal struggles that define Creasy as a character. Even when circumstances become increasingly dramatic, Washington never abandons the emotional realism established during the opening portions of the film. Maintaining that level of authenticity across such an emotionally demanding role requires extraordinary discipline, and it's one of the reasons so many critics and audiences continue placing this performance among the best of his career. Dakota Fanning also deserves continued praise because she provides the emotional balance that keeps the movie grounded. Her natural screen presence allows every interaction with Denzel Washington to feel completely believable. Rather than delivering rehearsed emotional moments, she reacts instinctively, creating scenes that feel spontaneous instead of carefully planned. This authenticity strengthens the audience's emotional connection and ensures that the relationship at the heart of the story never feels artificial. It's difficult to imagine another young actor delivering the role with the same level of sincerity. Tony Scott's direction remains one of the movie's defining strengths. His visual style is immediately recognizable, yet it never becomes repetitive or self-indulgent. Every creative decision appears motivated by emotion rather than spectacle. Whether through changing color palettes, energetic editing, unusual camera movement, or layered visual textures, Scott constantly reinforces the psychological atmosphere surrounding the characters. Instead of treating action as the primary attraction, he uses visual style to deepen emotional engagement, making the audience feel connected to the characters' inner struggles. Paul Cameron's cinematography deserves equal recognition because of how effectively it complements Scott's vision. His photography captures both the intimacy of personal relationships and the scale of the surrounding world without ever losing focus. Mexico City remains one of the film's strongest visual elements, presented with honesty rather than stereotype. Busy streets, elegant neighborhoods, crowded public spaces, and quieter residential areas all contribute to an environment that feels authentic and lived in. This realistic setting adds credibility to every emotional interaction and strengthens the overall atmosphere. The editing by Pietro Scalia continues to stand out because it refuses to follow conventional Hollywood formulas. Instead of maintaining a single rhythm throughout the movie, the editing constantly adapts to the emotional state of the characters. Reflective scenes unfold patiently, while moments of tension become increasingly fragmented and energetic. These transitions never feel random because they mirror Creasy's psychological journey. The result is a viewing experience that feels emotionally immersive rather than mechanically paced. Harry Gregson Williams once again demonstrates remarkable restraint through his musical score. Rather than overwhelming emotional scenes with dramatic orchestral music, he frequently allows quieter melodies to carry the emotional weight. Piano themes, subtle strings, and carefully placed electronic textures quietly support the performances without distracting from them. This thoughtful approach makes the score memorable because it serves the story instead of competing for attention. It's one of the finest examples of music enhancing emotion through subtlety rather than volume. The production design continues contributing to the film's realism in ways audiences may not consciously notice. Chris Seegers and his team created environments that feel authentic rather than stylized. Every location contains practical details that suggest real people occupy these spaces outside the events of the story. This attention to everyday realism helps viewers accept the world completely, allowing performances to become even more emotionally convincing. Great production design often succeeds by remaining invisible, and that's certainly the case here. One fascinating behind-the-scenes detail involves Tony Scott's dedication to post-production. He reportedly spent months refining the film's visual rhythm, working closely with editor Pietro Scalia to ensure every transition reflected the emotional progression of the story. Scott believed editing was one of the most powerful storytelling tools available, and he approached it with extraordinary precision. That commitment explains why Man on Fire feels so visually distinctive even compared to Scott's other films. The supporting cast also deserves more appreciation than it often receives. Christopher Walken delivers another memorable performance with his trademark calm presence, while Giancarlo Giannini, Marc Anthony, Radha Mitchell, Mickey Rourke, and Rachel Ticotin all add authenticity to the world surrounding Creasy. None of these performances feel exaggerated or unnecessary. Instead, every supporting actor contributes something meaningful to the emotional atmosphere, helping the story feel populated by believable individuals rather than generic background characters. Over time, Man on Fire has become one of those rare films whose reputation has continued improving long after its theatrical release. While some critics initially questioned Tony Scott's aggressive visual style, many later revisited the film and recognized how closely those techniques supported its emotional themes. Audiences, meanwhile, embraced the movie almost immediately, helping it build a loyal following through DVD sales, television broadcasts, and eventually streaming platforms. Today, it's widely regarded as one of the strongest collaborations between Tony Scott and Denzel Washington. Ultimately, what keeps Man on Fire relevant is its complete commitment to emotional storytelling. Every technical department, every performance, and every creative decision serves the same purpose of exploring redemption, purpose, trust, and sacrifice through deeply human characters. The action remains exciting, but it never overshadows the emotions driving it. That's why the movie continues finding new audiences year after year and why it remains one of the finest examples of how an action thriller can also become a genuinely moving character drama. One of the clearest signs that Man on Fire has become a modern classic is how often it appears in conversations about Denzel Washington's greatest performances. That's impressive when you consider the number of iconic roles he has played throughout his career. Washington has starred in courtroom dramas, crime thrillers, historical films, sports stories, and intense character studies, Yet John Creasy continues to stand alongside his most memorable work. The reason isn't that the role is the loudest or the most physically demanding. It's because it allows him to explore vulnerability, regret, compassion, and determination with remarkable honesty. Those emotional qualities stay with audiences far longer than any action sequence ever could. Brian Helgeland's screenplay deserves renewed appreciation because it understands the importance of emotional patience. Many modern thrillers rush from one dramatic event to another, rarely allowing characters enough time to breathe. Man on Fire takes the opposite approach. It understands that meaningful relationships develop gradually, and that emotional investment cannot be forced. By allowing conversations, quiet moments, and small personal interactions to unfold naturally, the screenplay creates a foundation that supports everything else. Viewers don't simply observe the characters, they begin to understand them. That connection is what gives the film its lasting emotional power. Denzel Washington's performance becomes even more impressive when considering how little he relies on dialogue to communicate emotion. Some actors depend on long speeches or dramatic confrontations to reveal their characters. Washington often accomplishes the same effect through silence. A thoughtful pause, a restrained smile, or the way he lowers his eyes during a conversation often says more than words ever could. This level of control reflects an actor who completely trusts both the audience and the material. He never feels the need to exaggerate emotion because he knows authenticity is always more powerful than performance designed to attract attention. Another remarkable aspect of Washington's work is the consistency of his emotional rhythm. Throughout the film, John Creasy evolves naturally without ever feeling like a completely different person. His growth feels earned because every emotional change develops gradually through experience. Washington never abandons the quiet sadness that defines the character, even as his confidence slowly returns. That continuity gives the performance extraordinary credibility and helps explain why audiences continue responding to it so strongly after more than 2 decades. Dakota Fanning also deserves enormous recognition for helping create one of the most memorable relationships in modern action cinema. She never approaches the role with exaggerated innocence or obvious emotional manipulation. Instead, she brings honesty, intelligence, and warmth to every scene. Her natural chemistry with Washington remains one of the film's greatest achievements because it never feels manufactured. Their conversations resemble genuine human interaction rather than scripted emotional moments, making the audience's investment feel completely earned. Tony Scott's direction deserves even greater admiration today because of how confidently it embraces visual storytelling. Instead of relying solely on dialogue or traditional editing, Scott uses every cinematic tool available to communicate emotion. Lighting, color, camera movement, editing rhythms, subtitles, and visual textures all become extensions of the character's psychological experiences. While some critics initially viewed these techniques as excessive, many later recognized that Scott wasn't experimenting simply for style. Every visual choice supports the emotional core of the film, giving Man on Fire an identity unlike almost any other thriller of its time. Paul Cameron's cinematography remains essential to that identity. His photography balances intimacy with scale beautifully, allowing viewers to appreciate both subtle performances and the larger environment surrounding them. Mexico City continues feeling vibrant, complex, and authentic throughout the film. Rather than reducing the location to a collection of familiar images, Cameron presents a living city filled with everyday life, cultural richness, and emotional contrast. This authenticity strengthens the realism of the story and gives every scene greater emotional credibility. Pietro Scalia's editing deserves another mention because it continues to influence how people remember the movie. Rather than following a predictable rhythm, the editing constantly adapts to emotional tone. Scenes built around reflection unfold patiently, allowing performances to resonate, while moments of tension become fragmented in ways that reflect psychological pressure instead of simple physical excitement. This emotional editing style was bold at the time of release and remains one of the film's defining technical achievements today. Harry Gregson Williams delivers another outstanding contribution through a score that understands the value of restraint. Instead of filling every emotional scene with dramatic orchestration, he frequently chooses simplicity. Gentle piano melodies, restrained strings, and subtle electronic textures create an atmosphere that feels intimate without becoming sentimental. This disciplined approach allows the performances to remain the emotional center while quietly strengthening their impact. It's one of those scores that becomes more appreciated with every revisit. The production design by Chris Seegers quietly reinforces the authenticity visible throughout the movie. Every location appears functional, occupied, and believable. Homes contain personal details, workplaces feel practical, and public spaces reflect everyday activity rather than artificial cinematic perfection. These choices may seem invisible while watching, but they create an immersive world where audiences instinctively accept everything happening around the characters. Great production design often succeeds without demanding attention, and that's exactly what happens here. One fascinating behind-the-scenes fact is that Tony Scott remained deeply involved in shaping the film even after principal photography ended. During post-production, he worked extensively on color timing, editing rhythms, and visual textures to ensure the emotional tone remained consistent throughout the movie. Scott believed the emotional experience of a film continued evolving in the editing room, and Man on Fire became one of his most carefully crafted projects because of that philosophy. His commitment to refining every visual detail is still evident today. The film's commercial success also deserves perspective. Produced on an estimated budget of around $70 million, it earned approximately $130 million worldwide, making it a solid financial success. More importantly, its popularity continued growing through DVD releases, cable television, and streaming platforms. Unlike many movies that fade after their theatrical run, Man on Fire found new audiences year after year. Its reputation expanded through recommendations rather than marketing campaigns, proving that emotionally powerful storytelling often enjoys a much longer life than temporary box office records. Perhaps the most meaningful aspect of the film's legacy is how it continues connecting with viewers of different generations. Some appreciate it primarily for Denzel Washington's extraordinary performance, while others admire Tony Scott's bold filmmaking style or the emotional relationship at the center of the story. Film students often study its editing, cinematography, and direction, while casual audiences simply enjoy an engaging and emotionally satisfying thriller. Very few movies succeed on so many different levels simultaneously. Looking back today, it's clear that Man on Fire earned its reputation through craftsmanship rather than spectacle. Every department worked toward the same emotional goal, creating a film where writing, acting, directing, cinematography, editing, music, and production design support one another instead of competing for attention. That's why the movie remains so memorable. It reminds audiences that the strongest action films aren't defined by how much destruction appears on screen but by how deeply they care about the people experiencing it. That emotional truth is what continues making Man on Fire one of the finest revenge dramas ever made. It's easy to understand why Man on Fire has become one of those films people recommend without hesitation. It's not simply because the movie is entertaining, although it certainly is. It's because it offers something that many action thrillers never managed to achieve. It creates an emotional experience that stays with the audience long after the final credits have finished. Viewers may initially remember the intense action or Denzel Washington's unforgettable screen presence, but over time it's the emotional honesty, the relationships, and the atmosphere that become impossible to forget. That's the mark of a film with genuine staying power. One of the screenplay's greatest strengths is its refusal to chase trends. Even though the movie was released in 2004, its writing doesn't feel trapped in that era. Brian Helgeland focuses on timeless themes rather than temporary cultural references or fashionable storytelling techniques. Ideas such as redemption, trust, loneliness, sacrifice, and the search for personal purpose remain just as meaningful today as they were 20 years ago. Because the emotional foundation is universal, the film continues speaking to new audiences regardless of when they discover it. Denzel Washington's performance remains the emotional anchor that holds everything together. Watching the film again after several years often reveals new details that may have gone unnoticed the first time. Tiny expressions, subtle pauses, restrained body language, and carefully controlled dialogue all contribute to a character who feels astonishingly real. Washington never asks viewers to admire John Creasy. Instead, he asks them to understand him. That distinction makes the performance remarkably human and explains why it continues being discussed whenever people rank the finest work of his career. Another reason the performance remains so effective is Washington's complete commitment to emotional truth. He never allows the character to become overly heroic or artificially inspirational. Creasy always feels like someone carrying the weight of his past, even during moments of renewed confidence. That emotional consistency prevents the story from becoming unrealistic. Audiences recognize pieces of themselves within his struggles because the performance acknowledges that emotional healing is rarely simple or complete. It's an honest portrayal of someone trying to rediscover meaning after believing all hope has disappeared. Dakota Fanning deserves continued recognition because her contribution is every bit as essential to the film's success. Without believable chemistry between the two lead performances, the emotional impact would never feel as powerful. Fanning brings warmth, intelligence, humor, and sincerity to every scene, making her character feel like a genuine person rather than a plot device. The trust that gradually develops between her and Creasy remains one of the movie's most memorable achievements because it grows naturally through everyday interaction instead of dramatic shortcuts. Tony Scott's direction has arguably become even more respected over time than it was during the film's original release. Many of his creative choices seemed unusual in 2004, but modern audiences often view them as innovative rather than excessive. His use of layered imagery, changing film textures, expressive color grading, handwritten subtitles, and emotionally driven editing creates a visual language that perfectly matches the psychological atmosphere of the story. Rather than making the film feel dated, these stylistic decisions have helped it develop a unique identity that still stands apart from contemporary action cinema. Paul Cameron's cinematography remains another major reason the movie has aged so gracefully. His visual approach balances realism with artistic expression, allowing every frame to support both character and atmosphere. Mexico City continues feeling authentic throughout the film because Cameron captures it as a real place filled with complexity rather than simply a backdrop for dramatic events. The architecture, neighborhoods, public spaces, and everyday life all contribute to an environment that strengthens the emotional realism of the story. Pietro Scalia's editing deserves continued praise because of how successfully it translates emotion into rhythm. Instead of maintaining one consistent pace, the editing constantly responds to the psychological state of the characters. Peaceful moments unfold patiently, while emotional pressure creates increasingly fragmented visual patterns. This approach helps audiences feel what the characters are experiencing rather than simply observing events from the outside. It's one of the clearest examples of editing functioning as emotional storytelling instead of purely technical craftsmanship. Harry Gregson Williams' score quietly supports that emotional rhythm throughout the film. The music rarely calls attention to itself, yet its influence can be felt in nearly every important scene. Soft orchestral themes, restrained piano melodies, and carefully layered electronic textures create an atmosphere that feels intimate without becoming sentimental. The soundtrack understands that emotional honesty requires subtlety, and that restraint allows the performances to remain the primary focus while still enhancing every significant moment. The supporting cast also deserves another mention because every actor contributes something meaningful to the overall experience. Christopher Walken brings quiet wisdom and calm authority. Giancarlo Giannini adds emotional complexity. Marc Anthony delivers one of his strongest dramatic performances, while Radha Mitchell and Mickey Rourke each leave memorable impressions despite relatively limited screen time. These performances strengthen the world surrounding Creasy, making every interaction feel authentic rather than simply advancing the plot. One particularly interesting behind-the-scenes detail is how much attention Tony Scott devoted to creating the film's visual identity during post-production. Rather than treating editing and color grading as routine technical processes, he viewed them as essential storytelling tools. Every visual texture, subtitle, transition, and color adjustment was carefully refined to support the emotional atmosphere. This meticulous attention to detail explains why Man on Fire feels so visually cohesive despite its highly experimental style. Nothing appears accidental because every artistic decision serves the same emotional purpose. The movie's influence can also be seen in many later action thrillers that attempted to combine emotional storytelling with visually expressive filmmaking. While few achieved the same balance, Man on Fire demonstrated that audiences were willing to embrace action films built around character development instead of non-stop spectacle. Its success encouraged filmmakers to treat emotional depth as a strength rather than an obstacle, leaving a subtle but lasting mark on the genre. More than 20 years after its release, the film continues attracting viewers who have heard about it through recommendations rather than advertising. That's often the strongest indication of lasting quality. Movies that survive through word of mouth usually do so because they create genuine emotional connections. People recommend them not because they were commercially successful, but because they remember how they felt while watching them. Man on Fire belongs firmly in that category, continuing to reach new audiences through reputation alone. Ultimately, what makes this film so enduring is its complete confidence in emotional storytelling. It never relies on empty spectacle to create excitement or artificial sentiment to create emotion. Instead, it trusts strong performances, thoughtful writing, bold direction, beautiful cinematography, intelligent editing, and carefully crafted music to tell a deeply human story. That confidence has allowed Man on Fire to remain one of the most respected revenge thrillers ever made and one of the finest collaborations between Denzel Washington and Tony Scott. Its emotional impact remains just as powerful today as it was when audiences first experienced it. As the years have passed, Man on Fire has gradually become one of those rare films that seems to improve with age. That's an unusual achievement because many action movies are closely tied to the filmmaking trends of their era. Visual effects become outdated, storytelling styles change, and what once felt exciting can eventually seem ordinary. Man on Fire has avoided that fate because its greatest strengths were never based on temporary trends. Instead, they were built on timeless storytelling, believable performances, and genuine emotional depth. Those qualities remain just as effective today as they were when audiences first experienced the film in 2004. One of the screenplay's most impressive accomplishments is its understanding of emotional restraint. Brian Helgeland never tries to force the audience into feeling a particular emotion. Instead, he allows scenes to develop naturally, trusting viewers to respond honestly to the characters and their relationships. That confidence is surprisingly refreshing. Modern films sometimes rely too heavily on dramatic dialogue or obvious emotional cues, but Man on Fire often says more through silence than many movies manage with pages of conversation. This understated writing gives the story lasting emotional credibility. Denzel Washington's portrayal of John Creasy continues standing as one of the defining performances of his remarkable career. One reason it remains so memorable is that Washington completely avoids making the character appear invincible. Creasy is emotionally wounded, physically exhausted, and burdened by years of regret. Washington embraces those imperfections instead of hiding them, creating someone who feels completely believable. Audiences don't admire him because he's perfect. They connect with him because he's deeply human. That emotional honesty is what transforms an already strong screenplay into something genuinely unforgettable. Another aspect of Washington's performance worth celebrating is his extraordinary control over pacing. Every scene unfolds at exactly the emotional speed it needs. He never rushes dramatic moments or exaggerates quiet ones. His timing allows conversations to breathe naturally, making interactions feel spontaneous rather than rehearsed. This patience becomes one of the performance's greatest strengths because it encourages audiences to observe rather than simply react. Watching Creasy gradually rediscover purpose feels believable precisely because Washington never forces that transformation. Dakota Fanning's contribution remains equally remarkable. Looking back now, it's astonishing how naturally she held her own opposite one of Hollywood's greatest actors. Her performance carries warmth without becoming sentimental, intelligence without feeling unrealistic, and emotional honesty without relying on obvious dramatic techniques. She never appears to be acting for the audience. Instead, she simply exists within the story, responding truthfully to every situation. That authenticity explains why her relationship with Creasy remains the emotional center of the entire film. Tony Scott's direction deserves even greater admiration today because it represents a filmmaker completely confident in his own artistic voice. Rather than following conventional Hollywood formulas, Scott embraced a highly personal visual style that reflected emotion above all else. His use of expressive editing, changing color palettes, layered imagery, and unconventional subtitles wasn't designed simply to look different. Every technique served the psychological atmosphere surrounding the characters. Although these creative choices divided critics at the time, they've become one of the film's most celebrated qualities in retrospect. Paul Cameron's cinematography remains equally deserving of praise. His work captures Mexico City with remarkable authenticity, presenting it as a living environment filled with complexity rather than a stereotypical backdrop for action. The city's architecture, neighborhoods, traffic, public spaces, and daily life all contribute to a world that feels completely believable. Cameron also demonstrates tremendous sensitivity during quieter emotional scenes, using lighting and composition to support performances without drawing unnecessary attention to the camera itself. This balance between visual style and emotional realism remains one of the movie's greatest technical achievements. Editor Pietro Scalia also deserves enormous recognition because his work fundamentally shapes the emotional rhythm of the film. Rather than following predictable editing patterns, Scalia constantly adjusts pace according to the character's psychological state. Reflective moments are allowed to unfold patiently, while periods of emotional tension become increasingly fragmented through rapid visual transitions. This approach creates an immersive experience where viewers don't simply observe the story, they emotionally experience it alongside the characters. Few editors manage to make pacing feel so deeply connected to emotion. Harry Gregson Williams once again demonstrates exceptional restraint through his musical score. Instead of constantly reminding audiences when to feel emotional, he quietly supports the performances with understated melodies and subtle orchestral textures. The soundtrack never overwhelms the story because it understands its role perfectly. Music enhances emotion already present within the performances rather than attempting to create emotion artificially. That level of discipline helps the score remain effective even after multiple viewings and contributes greatly to the movie's lasting emotional impact. The production design continues reinforcing realism through countless small details that audiences may barely notice consciously. Every environment feels lived in, practical, and authentic. Homes reflect the personalities of their occupants, public spaces maintain natural imperfections, and workplaces appear genuinely functional. These design choices quietly strengthen audience immersion because nothing feels artificially constructed simply for cinematic effect. It's another example of how every department consistently prioritized authenticity over spectacle. One particularly fascinating behind-the-scenes fact involves the collaboration between Tony Scott and his technical team during post-production. Scott reportedly spent extensive time perfecting color timing, visual textures, subtitle placement, and editing rhythms until every scene reflected the emotional atmosphere he envisioned. This obsessive attention to detail demonstrates why Man on Fire feels so visually unified despite its experimental style. Every artistic decision contributes to the same emotional experience, creating a level of consistency rarely achieved in large-scale studio productions. The movie's reputation has also benefited enormously from changing critical opinion. While reviews upon release were somewhat mixed regarding Scott's visual techniques, many later reassessments praised exactly those same qualities. Critics began recognizing that the aggressive editing, layered imagery, and unusual cinematography weren't distractions but deliberate storytelling tools designed to place audiences inside Creasy's emotional perspective. This shift in critical opinion has helped solidify Man on Fire as one of Tony Scott's most respected directorial achievements. Perhaps the strongest evidence of the film's lasting success is how frequently it's recommended by viewers who genuinely love cinema. Recommendations based on personal enthusiasm tend to have much longer lives than marketing campaigns or temporary box office success. People continue introducing friends and family to Man on Fire because they know the experience offers something memorable beyond action alone. The emotional journey, unforgettable performances, distinctive direction, and technical craftsmanship combine to create a movie that feels just as rewarding on a fifth viewing as it does on the first. Looking back after more than 2 decades, it's difficult to imagine the revenge thriller genre without Man on Fire occupying such an important place within it. The film proved that emotionally driven storytelling could exist alongside stylish action without sacrificing either element. It challenged expectations, trusted its audience, and delivered a cinematic experience built on authenticity rather than spectacle. That's why it continues standing as one of the finest action dramas of the modern era and remains a benchmark for filmmakers hoping to combine technical ambition with genuine emotional depth. When people look back at Man on Fire, they usually remember Denzel Washington's incredible performance first. But the longer you think about the movie, the more you realize that its success came from every department working toward the same goal. There isn't one element carrying the entire film. The screenplay provides emotional depth, the direction creates a unique visual identity, the cinematography builds atmosphere, the editing shapes emotional rhythm, the music strengthens every important moment, and the cast brings complete honesty to every scene. It's this rare level of creative unity that allows the film to remain so powerful after more than 2 decades. Brian Helgeland's screenplay deserves one final round of appreciation because it understands that great characters don't need constant explanation. John Creasy isn't introduced through lengthy backstory or dramatic speeches. Instead, viewers gradually learn who he is by watching how he behaves, how he reacts to people, and how his outlook slowly changes. This show rather than tell approach gives the audience room to form their own emotional connection. The script trusts viewers to notice subtle changes instead of pointing everything out, and that confidence makes the storytelling feel mature and rewarding. Denzel Washington's performance benefits enormously from that style of writing. Since the screenplay never over-explains Creasy's emotions, Washington communicates them through performance alone. Few actors are capable of expressing so much through silence, and that's exactly what makes his work here unforgettable. A simple glance, a thoughtful pause, or a slight change in posture often reveals more than dialogue ever could. These quiet details transform Creasy from a familiar action hero into a deeply human character. It's a performance built on emotional truth rather than dramatic spectacle, and that's why it has aged so gracefully. Dakota Fanning deserves equal recognition because she never allows the emotional balance of the film to disappear. Her performance remains completely natural from beginning to end. She never feels like a child actor trying to impress audiences with dramatic moments. Instead, she reacts honestly to every situation, creating a believable relationship that gradually becomes the emotional heart of the movie. The chemistry between Washington and Fanning still stands among the finest examples of an adult actor and a child performer sharing the screen in modern Hollywood cinema. Tony Scott's direction continues to feel bold even by today's standards. While many action directors rely on familiar visual formulas, Scott constantly searched for new ways to express emotion through filmmaking itself. Rapid editing, layered imagery, shifting colors, handwritten subtitles, changing camera speeds, and expressive compositions all contribute to a visual style that immediately distinguishes Man on Fire from countless other thrillers. More importantly, those stylistic choices never exist for their own sake. Every creative decision reflects the emotional condition of the characters, making style and storytelling work together seamlessly. Paul Cameron's cinematography strengthens that vision by capturing every location with remarkable authenticity. Mexico City never feels like a simple backdrop or a collection of tourist landmarks. Instead, it becomes a living environment filled with personality, energy, beauty, and unpredictability. Cameron's photography also gives actors the space to shine. Close-up shots reveal subtle emotional performances, while wider compositions remind viewers of the larger world surrounding the characters. This careful balance between intimacy and scale helps create a film that feels both personal and cinematic. Editor Pietro Scalia deserves enormous praise because the movie's emotional impact depends heavily on its rhythm. His editing constantly adjusts according to the emotional state of the story. Peaceful conversations unfold naturally without unnecessary interruptions, while emotionally intense moments become increasingly fragmented through carefully controlled visual transitions. This editing style doesn't simply make the movie look energetic. It helps audiences experience Creasy's psychological journey from the inside. That's an extraordinary achievement and one of the reasons the film still feels unique today. Harry Gregson Williams also contributes one of the most emotionally effective scores of his career. Instead of overwhelming scenes with constant orchestral power, he understands the importance of subtlety. Gentle piano melodies, restrained orchestral themes, and carefully layered electronic textures quietly reinforce the performances without distracting from them. The music feels like another emotional voice within the story rather than background decoration. That thoughtful approach allows the soundtrack to remain memorable without ever becoming overpowering. The supporting cast also deserves another mention because every performance adds credibility to the world surrounding Creasy. Christopher Walken brings calm wisdom, Giancarlo Giannini delivers emotional depth, Marc Anthony surprises with a convincing dramatic performance, while Mickey Rourke, Radha Mitchell, Rachel Ticotin, and the rest of the ensemble all contribute believable performances that strengthen the story. None of these characters exist simply to fill screen time. Every actor helps create a world that feels populated by genuine people rather than fictional stereotypes. One particularly interesting production fact is that Tony Scott remained deeply involved in every stage of post-production, personally refining visual effects, subtitle placement, editing rhythms, and color grading until the emotional tone matched his original vision. He believed filmmaking didn't end when shooting wrapped. The emotional experience continued evolving inside the editing room, and Man on Fire became one of his most carefully crafted projects because of that philosophy. His dedication to detail can still be seen in every frame. Financially, the film performed well, earning roughly $130 million worldwide against an estimated $70 million budget. While those numbers represented a commercial success, the movie's greatest achievement came later. Through DVD releases, television broadcasts, Blu-ray editions, and streaming platforms, Man on Fire gradually reached millions of additional viewers. Many people who now consider it a favorite didn't watch it during its original theatrical run. Instead, they discovered it years later through recommendations from friends, family, or online discussions. That's often how genuine classics continue growing long after leaving theaters. The critical response has also evolved significantly. Early reviews were divided over Tony Scott's experimental visual style, but later reassessments recognized that those same techniques played an essential role in expressing the film's emotional themes. Modern critics frequently describe Man on Fire as one of Scott's finest achievements and one of Denzel Washington's greatest performances. The movie has become a perfect example of how audience appreciation and critical opinion can evolve over time as people revisit a film with fresh perspective. Ultimately, Man on Fire succeeds because it never forgets that emotional connection is more important than spectacle. Every creative decision serves the characters first, allowing the action to feel meaningful instead of empty. The screenplay explores timeless themes with honesty, the performances remain unforgettable, the direction continues feeling visually distinctive, and every technical department contributes to the same emotional experience. More than 20 years after its release, the film still stands as one of the greatest revenge dramas ever made, not because it relied on bigger explosions or louder action, but because it understood that audiences remember heartfelt storytelling far longer than they remember spectacle alone. After spending time looking at every major aspect of Man on Fire, one conclusion becomes impossible to ignore. This is far more than a well-made revenge thriller. It's a film that combines emotional storytelling, outstanding performances, confident direction, and remarkable technical craftsmanship into something that continues to resonate with audiences decades after its release. Plenty of action movies have arrived since 2004 with larger budgets, bigger explosions, and more advanced visual effects, yet very few have managed to create the same emotional connection that Tony Scott's film achieves so effortlessly. The biggest reason for that lasting impact is the emotional honesty running through every scene. The screenplay never takes shortcuts when developing its characters, and it never treats emotions as obstacles standing in the way of the action. Instead, every major moment grows naturally from believable relationships and carefully established motivations. Because of that approach, viewers don't simply admire what happens on screen, they genuinely care about the people involved. That emotional investment is what separates memorable films from forgettable ones, and Man on Fire earns it through patience rather than manipulation. Denzel Washington delivers what many fans still consider one of the finest performances of his career. John Creasy isn't written as a flawless action hero, and Washington never tries to turn him into one. He embraces every weakness, every emotional scar, and every quiet moment of vulnerability, creating a character who feels remarkably real. Even after multiple viewings, new details continue revealing themselves through his expressions, body language, and restrained dialogue delivery. It's the kind of performance that reminds audiences why Washington has remained one of Hollywood's most respected actors for so many years. Dakota Fanning deserves equal praise because the emotional success of the film depends heavily on the authenticity of her relationship with Creasy. She never overacts, never forces emotional moments, and never feels like she's simply fulfilling a role within the story. Instead, she creates a believable character whose warmth and sincerity gradually transform the emotional atmosphere of the film. Watching her share the screen with Denzel Washington remains one of the movie's greatest pleasures, and their chemistry continues standing among the strongest actor pairings of the genre. Tony Scott also deserves recognition for creating one of the most visually distinctive films of his career. His directing style was bold enough to divide opinion when the movie first premiered, but time has been incredibly kind to his creative choices. Today, many of those same stylistic decisions are viewed as innovative examples of emotionally driven filmmaking rather than unnecessary visual experimentation. Scott proved that action cinema could be expressive without sacrificing clarity, and his influence can still be seen in many modern thrillers that attempt to blend emotion with striking visual style. Paul Cameron's cinematography remains beautiful without ever becoming distracting. Every frame supports the emotional tone of the story, whether through carefully controlled lighting, intimate close-ups, or wide shots that capture the energy of Mexico City. The city itself becomes an essential part of the atmosphere, contributing realism and personality to every scene. Combined with Chris Seeger's production design, the locations feel authentic enough that audiences quickly forget they're watching a carefully constructed Hollywood production. Pietro Scalia's editing continues standing as one of the film's greatest technical achievements. His work transforms emotional rhythm into visual language, allowing audiences to feel psychological tension rather than simply observe it. Harry Gregson Williams complements that rhythm with a beautifully restrained score that quietly supports performances without overwhelming them. Together, these departments demonstrate how technical filmmaking can strengthen emotional storytelling instead of competing with it. The supporting cast deserves one final acknowledgement as well. Christopher Walken, Giancarlo Giannini, Marc Anthony, Mickey Rourke, Radha Mitchell, Rachel Ticotin, and the rest of the ensemble all contribute believable performances that enrich the world surrounding Creasy. None of these characters feel unnecessary. Every actor adds another layer of authenticity, making the story feel populated by real individuals rather than fictional archetypes. From a production standpoint, the film remains equally impressive. Produced with an estimated budget of around $70 million, it earned approximately $130 million worldwide. While that represented a successful theatrical run, its true achievement came afterward. Home video, television broadcasts, Blu-ray releases, and streaming services introduced the movie to entirely new generations of viewers. Rather than fading from public memory, Man on Fire steadily grew in reputation until it became one of the defining revenge thrillers of modern cinema. Critical opinion also changed significantly over time. Early reviews often questioned Tony Scott's aggressive editing style and visual experimentation, but later reassessments praised those exact qualities for helping communicate the emotional state of the characters. Today, the film is frequently listed among the finest revenge dramas ever made, and many critics now consider it one of Tony Scott's greatest directorial achievements. Audience appreciation has remained consistently strong throughout, proving that emotional storytelling often ages better than temporary trends. Perhaps the most impressive accomplishment of Man on Fire is how easily it appeals to different kinds of viewers. Fans of action appreciate its intensity, film lovers admire its craftsmanship, aspiring filmmakers study its direction and editing, while general audiences connect with its emotional story. Very few movies succeed across so many different levels. It offers excitement without becoming shallow, emotion without becoming sentimental, and style without sacrificing substance. More than 20 years later, Man on Fire still feels surprisingly modern because its emotional themes remain timeless. Redemption, trust, sacrifice, hope, and the search for purpose are ideas that never become outdated. The film explores them with sincerity, intelligence, and respect for its audience, allowing every viewing to reveal something new. That's why people continue recommending it year after year, and why its reputation only seems to grow stronger with time. If you're looking for an action movie filled only with explosions and non-stop gunfights, you'll certainly find plenty of excitement here. But if you're looking for a film that combines thrilling action with unforgettable performances, meaningful storytelling, stunning direction, beautiful cinematography, and genuine emotional depth, Man on Fire remains one of the very best choices you can make. It isn't simply one of Denzel Washington's greatest films or one of Tony Scott's finest achievements. It stands as one of the most emotionally powerful revenge thrillers ever made, and it fully deserves the classic status it enjoys today. That wraps up our review of Man on Fire, 2004. Even after more than 2 decades, it's still one of those rare action films that delivers much more than great action. Outstanding performances, emotional storytelling, unforgettable direction, and a powerful soundtrack all come together to create a movie that's easy to recommend and even easier to remember. If you've already seen Man on Fire, let us know your thoughts in the comments. Do you think this is Denzel Washington's best performance, or do you have another favorite? We'd love to hear your opinion. If you enjoyed this review, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next movie review and movie facts video. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.